Welcome, everybody, to this edition of our Daring Cities discussion on building resilience in small island developing states. Regions, which you are no doubt aware, are grappling with extreme climate vulnerability. Just to note that this session is being recorded. I'll start off with an introduction. I am Sharon Govender, the Programs and Partnerships Lead at ICLEI Oceania. Together with my esteemed panelists today, our discussion delves into ways in which local communities are heeding the call to combat climate change with support from various instruments and development partners. Before we begin the proceedings, however, I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining you from today. That's the Binjar Gunnar community of Western Australia. And in doing so, we recognize the resilience of elders past, present, and future. As alluded to at the start, small island development states, or SIDS as you would hear throughout the session, are at the front line of the climate emergency. And their unique intersections of vulnerability, that is, geographic remoteness, sea level rise, and inundation and exposure to coastal flooding risks, food and livelihood insecurity, high degrees of dependence on external resources and limited government resources undoubtedly compound the complexity of climate risks to which local communities need to respond for survival. This session will explore community-centered approaches as a mechanism to mainstream inclusion, equity, and holistic planning for building resilience and self-reliance in small island developing states. So without further ado, let me introduce you to my fellow panelists. We have Margarita Murdoch-Barrow. She's a project coordinator for the Kiribati Local Government Association in Kilga. And she's also a former representative of Kiribati to the UN General Assembly. We have Mr. Ronald Jackson, the head of disaster risk and reduction and recovery for building resilience, the Crisis Bureau for the United Nations Development Program. Jennifer Phillips, the advisor for the Global Shield Secretariat, and Steve Gala, the regional director for ICLEI Oceania. Now, the first segment of the discussion, each panelist will describe their current organizational roles and their current work in fostering resilience for communities in SIDS. Margarita, let's start with you.
Okay, good afternoon. It might be obvious that I'm not Margarita. So this demonstrates, I think, the issues that we're dealing with. I'm Steve, the Regional Director at ICLEI Oceania, working closely with Margarita in Kiribati. I've been there for several weeks this year, so I think I've got the background to speak on her behalf. But yes, she's trying to come in and her internet has not yet enabled her to connect. So I'd like to give you a brief introduction to her role, not my role. And that's based on what we're calling the Kiribati Blue-Green Development Project. Next slide, thanks, Kat. And it's a partnership project. It focuses on the two councils of the main part of Kiribati. And Kiribati is a chain of tiny, tiny atoll islands. Most of their population is squeezed into just two council areas on what's called South Taroa. So the two councils are Tenenano, which we call TUC, and Beso Town Councils, and the partners are our own organisation, Commonwealth Local Government Forum, the Kiribati Local Government Association, and it's funded through the German government. It's a project, thanks, next slide, which has been running now for approximately 10 months. And it's to build the resilience of 10 communities or villages within those two council areas, coming out of both the COVID pandemic, but also going into the climate change emergency. And the council selected those 10 communities. We're actually working with smaller groups within the communities, so we've really gone down to ground zero. Next slide, thank you. So it's bottom up. This is absolute bottom up, and you'll see the evidence for that in a moment. And we've been having intensive consultations with them. When I say consultation, I mean we sit in their meeting houses, which are called Maneaba, and we ask them about their recent experiences. We ask them what they understand about what's happening with climate change, how it's impacting on their communities, what are their greatest risks, and what's their initial thinking about how they can respond. So next slide, please, is the evidence. So that's a typical Maneaba building, and that's the end of one of our meetings, and I'm in the back, middle of the back. On my right-hand side is Margarita, the lady in the dark top, so I'm speaking on her behalf, and on the left side of me is Jane Stanley, who's one of our technical experts. Next slide. As Sharon said, these islands are just so vulnerable. It's the highest point of this part of the country is 3 metres above sea level. This is a village which has already been divided up by the sea smashing through the seawall. So twice a day now with high tides, those houses are separated, cut off from the services in the main village. Next slide, please. So all of the problems that they're experiencing, sea level rise, tidal surge, high winds, cyclonic rainfall. The soil is completely salinated now, as is the groundwater, which means they can't use the water for drinking or for agriculture. The temperature is getting gradually higher, and they have longer dry spells. So food security, water security, 2 of the biggest issues. And I'm just about finished my initial introduction. So our organisations have been helping the villages to conduct vulnerability risk assessments. We talk to them about the risks. We work out how and where and who that's going to hurt most. And so we're doing quite a lot of strong planning in behind. But most importantly, we take all our thinking back to the communities, and we had our validation meetings in July. This is what we think. Are we on the right track or not? And they will say, yes, 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 but no, that's not accurate. Our biggest problem is something else. So that's the project. Margarita is running that. Our organisations are in the background. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Steve, and for presenting that on behalf of Margarita. I think you've amplified the vulnerability that exists in the local context, and how imperative it is for bottom-up approaches to responding to this crisis, isn't it? Let's now move on to Ronald. Ronald, over to you, please.
Thank you, Sharon. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, very well, thank you.
And let me also thank ICLEI for inviting me to join this discussion today, and to participate in this excellent panel of experts. UNDP is a development organization, as you know, that focuses on bringing development solutions at scale, both in contexts that are beset by crisis, but also non-crisis. You will note that all strands of the 2030 agenda revolve around the concepts of sustainability, resilience, and equity, and commit to reduce vulnerability and exposure, as you'd have heard from Steve. And this certainly particularly when we consider SIDS facing the challenges of climate change and disaster risk. We note that the 2030 agenda affirms a commitment towards providing integrated solutions to meet development challenges confronting SIDS in particular. And this is important because we know that 6 of the SDGs themselves provide specific targets towards SIDS. They mention SIDS. So drawing from this inspiration, our organization, UNDP, provides a strategic plan, 2022 to 2025, that seeks to build resilience to risk and shocks, as well as associated issues and challenges that face communities with an effort to prevent and mitigate and respond to a number of these crises. And here we have, within UNDP, 6 signature solutions that are focusing on delivering these services, ranging from poverty reduction, resilience itself, governance, energy, as well as gender equality, and efforts within the context of how we address environmental issues. With a view of advancing this particular objective, a principal cornerstone of UNDP's strategic plan is our work in disaster and climate risk management. And this has one approach that focuses on community-based disaster risk management, which we call CBDRM. And this is used to augment the agency of local communities, actors, and stakeholders. In fact, nearly 2/3 of UNDP's projects on disaster and climate risk management have a dedicated community risk management track or resilience building lens to it. Going ahead, our work on community-based resilience building, especially in this current and what might be a future challenging context, such as those faced by SIDS, we offer, I would say, 6 approaches. 1, risk-informed and evidence-based approaches. So blending, linear with nonlinear risk analysis and diagnostics, resilience diagnostics, scenario-based approaches, and foresight approaches. We look at the intersectionality and interconnected issues across systems. We look at a multi-stakeholder driven processes. We also are looking to augment the resilience capacities that exist at community level. So looking at capacities around adaptive, anticipative, preventive, absorptive, and transformative. And we're very much now moving forward on our area-based approach to programming, and of course, scaling up many of our interventions that have taken place in community resilience building across the organization in a joined up manner. In terms of some of the examples we can point to, I can point to the joint UNDP UN Habitat Initiative, Urban Initiative for SIDS. And here we're looking at supporting national and city entities in SIDS to adopt a multi-risk analysis and resilience diagnostic lens, to identify resilience building needs at city and municipal levels, to implement risk and resilience actions to address resilience building dimensions, both in the socioeconomic sectors, such as water, energy, and food, and ensuring that no one is left behind. We have initiatives on urban resilience in Rousseau in Dominica, and of course, work that we're doing in other SIDS emerging as we speak. So I'll leave it there, and certainly, leave space for coming back on some of these important points. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no doubt about that, Ronald. I think you touched on important issues that would no doubt be explored further on in our discussion around community-based resilience. But it's fascinating and both inspiring to the transformational approaches that the UNDP has employed for the SIDS, and with a lens that looks at an intersectionality of various SDGs and responses to this. We'll get to, no doubt, delve into that later on in the discussion. Thank you. Jennifer, on to you, please.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join today's session. I'm very happy to be here on behalf of the Global Shield. And what I'd like to talk a bit about today is how the Global Shield is working to increase resilience of small island states and communities. And basically, this is because the Global Shield is working to address a specific problem that affects particularly small island states, which is the effect of natural hazards like hurricanes, tropical cyclones, earthquakes, tsunami, volcanic eruptions. The effects of these events on small island states can be astronomical, and the losses caused by these events can be equal to or even greater than the GDP of the country. And this is causing a huge crisis in countries because the result of these events is that often the country will need to take out large amounts of debt. And climate change so far has been estimated and its related losses to have eliminated 1/5 of the wealth of the vulnerable 20 countries over the last 2 decades. Vulnerable 20 countries include over 58 different countries, many of which are small island states. And this amount of wealth that's being lost due to these events is increasing over time. And it's severely affecting countries' ability to continue adapting to climate change, as well as to continue developing and investing money into their health, education, and infrastructure sectors when so much of their financial budgets need to be dedicated to debt repayment. And so one of the issues that the Global Shield is looking to help with is to equip countries with different financial instruments that can help them to better prepare and manage the consequences of these extreme events. Additionally, what's something that's often not spoken about is when countries are affected by these different climate hazards, the amount of time needed to arrange additional financing to help with the response and recovery efforts in the country can take months, if not years. And this can greatly exacerbate the effects of the climate hazard and the disaster in the country. And by working to develop these prearranged financial instruments, countries would then be able to receive support in a much quicker time period after these events. And so basically the Global Shield has 3 different objectives. The first one, which is providing countries with this comprehensive support and further understanding the risks that they are being faced with. Here, we cooperate together with the Global Risk Modeling Alliance in order to understand the data that's available in the country and where additional risk models are needed in order to better understand and predict future events and the effects that these events can have on the economy and on different vulnerable groups and communities within the country. We then work closely together with governments and stakeholders within the countries, including representatives from different civil society organizations and community groups, to identify what the best solutions would be for managing these different types of climate risk. Based on the country's request, we then provide grant-based financing and technical assistance to the countries to then work on developing these solutions. We know that being equipped with these financial instruments is very helpful to dealing with the impacts of these events, but there's often additional technical support and mechanisms that simultaneously need to be developed in order for this financing to be most effective and to reach the vulnerable groups in the quickest manner possible. Through the development of these different instruments, we then aim to see this immediate availability of resources after and before events, so that countries, businesses, communities, and individuals can better prepare for and much more quickly respond to these different disasters. And so the way that the Global Shield aims to do this is first by creating this global cooperation among many of the different stakeholders that are involved with developing these instruments. We work together through a coordination hub where we bring together the multilateral financial institutions, including the World Bank, regional development banks, the regional risk pools that play a large role in protecting small island states, as we see in the Caribbean with the CRIF SPC and in the Pacific with PCRIC, as well as many different implementing agencies, including UNDP and World Food Programme, to bring these actors together in order to create a coherent and comprehensive approach to determining what types of instruments would best meet countries' needs and how different instruments can be used to meet the needs on the micro, meso, and micro level. And so with that, I'll stop there, but looking forward to discussing more later.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jennifer. Firstly, it's been particularly insightful as to how you translate climate disasters into debt, because that's first and foremost what we are dealing with, and how the Global Shield is responding with various instruments, financial instruments, that is, to providing and alleviating these disasters. We'll no doubt get to delve into that further on in the conversation as well. All right. Yeah. All right. Steve, would you like to basically describe ICLEI's organizational role in fostering resilience in some of the small island development states in and around the Pacific?
Okay. Look, I might have the slide back up if I could. Kat, probably slide 10 would help. Okay. Keep going. That's it. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Sharon. So look, our work in Kiribati is replicated to some extent in a number of the other countries where we're also working, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Samoa, etc. And so we learn from our local community-based work some of the greatest pressures and opportunities which we can then translate to other islands. So this is getting back to the Kiribati project I introduced before, and the ground up generating opportunities from the community. So you can see that food security has come out as a very high priority, and there's some details on that slide about that. Some quite innovative approaches we're looking at. Cultivation of sea grapes is not commonly done, but it's got huge potential. Various ways of using seaweed, both seaweed that's been washed up on the beach, but also farming seaweed to make compost and fertilizer. Livestock production, formalising livestock production, because we found a lot of the villages, households will have 1 pig and 3 chickens, but that's not viable. And we've been talking to them about 1 or 2 households taking on actual farming of, in most cases, it would be pigs and chickens in this country, both of which are very tolerant to saltwater, interestingly, composting and aquaponics, which combines fish farming with vegetable production. So it just gives you an idea of some of the ideas which are coming out, and these are really building on local conversations. The next slide just shows how we're committed to working with local expertise wherever possible, because that's obviously a way of, number one, tapping into people who understand the local rules, the local context, but also by being able to resource them and help to systematise what they do. It's a capacity building step that we would typically take in lots of the islands. And the next slide simply talks about the fact that in Kiribati we've set up a panel, which we're about to start working. And the next slide, and the final one for this response, is talking about governance. Next slide, please, Kat. That's it. And I think this is underpinning everything, and it really gets back to why ICLEI is involved. Our role is to manage the relationship with the 2 councils, which are hosting all of this. The work that's being generated locally is expected to help them to develop their own climate resilience plan. They haven't got one. They're not too sure how to proceed. So we're demonstrating this at the local level. And we're also committed to the fact that all of the initiatives we're helping the communities to kick off will have local livelihoods benefits. In other words, part of our criteria is how can you run this initiative to help to generate an income for households, particularly for women, heads of households, young people. So we're focusing very strongly on that. How do you embed these projects in their traditional governance system, the Manayaba system? Because we need to make sure that when our intervention is over, there's actually understanding and ownership of the projects and of the management systems, the ability to keep managing, upgrading, maintaining, etc. And we all know that that's been a great failing with donor programs in the past. And then we lift it another level, and this is where ICLEI comes in, and our other partner, the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. And we brought our mayors together from the various countries 2 weeks ago in Fiji to the Pacific Urban Forum, and we had roundtables for the mayors and a lot of other associated activities. And it's all about spreading the word, introducing them on a peer-to-peer basis, helping to set up arrangements whereby they can start exchanging information and supporting one another. So we think that networking, but at a regional level and around real concrete projects, is critical. And probably the last point I'll make, and it gets back to what Jennifer was talking about, is financing options. One of the very strong messages from the Pacific Urban Forum mayors was it's very difficult for a city or a local government to get access to finance when most external financing goes via the national governments. So we've been very careful that the national government in Kiribati, the Office of the President, is our focal point, knows what's happening, understands the opportunities, and can help to secure finance from national down to council level, down to community level. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Steve. And there you hear it, folks. Driving local solutions and responding to unique local contexts. And that is, at the heart and center of how ICLEI's responding, not just in Kiribati, but throughout the Pacific. Steve, I just want you to hang on for a second, because it would be good for you to take us through your experience of how community meetings and priorities in that respect drive this bottom-up approach. And particularly, linking that with COVID resilience in Kiribati. Would you want to please share with us your experience?
I'll try. So the way we approached community meetings was through the host council, and the critical person there was the ward councillor responsible for that particular village. And so they would be a centrepiece, they would be a linchpin, and help to bring together a good range of people within the community. You saw from the photo, we might have 20 to 30 people. In one meeting, it was down to 12, and then one meeting was very large. It was hosted by one of the churches. So it was very important to give the responsibility to the local leaders and the local ward councillors to bring together a group. And it was fascinating, the range of people who came. Gender balance, we tended to have more women than men, which is perfect, exactly what we were hoping for. Some very, very smart, very well-educated people with professional backgrounds. Perhaps they don't work in the village during the day, they go up to the main town, come home at night. And we did ask them about their experiences. The discussion about the COVID, the pandemic, was interesting because it triggered a lot of the important issues. Because during the pandemic, one of the key things that happened was their supply chains were cut off. And one of the problems in islands is they've traditionally been reliant on imported goods, which generally are poor quality, packaged foods, highly expensive, and not necessarily appropriate. And that supply chain was cut off. And so the discussion now is how can you in the future be far more self-sufficient, producing and growing what you need locally. And so then if there is another major disruption, whether it's a war or a cyclone or a pandemic, you're much better situated for the next time around. And that's really resonated. So the ideas that they're coming up with, as you can see, they're very grassroots, but they actually open up the big issues of how do we deal with disasters, how do we build our self-sufficiency, how do we build our economic robustness, etc.
Yeah, that's been particularly insightful, and that bottom-up mainstreaming gender issues. That's all. It's a perfect response to community-based or resilience. Ronald, I am now going to put you on the spotlight. And in this sense, please share with us in what ways do national level investments, example, early warning systems or port upgrades, these are just examples. How do these investments comprehensively and meaningfully build community resilience?
Thank you, Sharon. I think I want to take this from the angle of perhaps what kind of national level investments we would want to encourage if we want to foster and build resilience in SIDS. I mean, not that we don't believe in the importance of early warning systems. We're heavily engaged and have invested, I think, over 700 million in the last within the last decade, and still contributing more to supporting early warning systems, as this is important to help mobilize communities. But I think a part of what also underpins the investments in early warning systems and looking at also local infrastructure investments, we believe it's important to invest in the fundamental platforms to drive and sustain resilience building, and to build sustainable communities. And so what do I mean? I mean, we've heard certainly a lot of very interesting initiatives from Geneva, from Steve, all provoking or thoughts around these approaches. We've heard some very interesting ideas, but I think it's important that we recognize that our world or countries are becoming more and more urbanized. And so our understanding of community also may require us to rethink, relook. Hence, very much our reference to not just communities in the way we've seen them as perhaps rural-based, etc., but also urban spaces. So in that regard, UNDP's investments in community resilience is also seeking to address a range of issues from vertical to horizontal on the spectrum, and is informed by the need to meet existing demands while developing enabling capacities to address a number of the emerging needs and priorities that are at play within this urban theater, so to speak, this urbanizing world. So let me enumerate perhaps maybe 4 or 5 areas where we think it's important for investments if we're going to underpin or create this sort of foundation for resilience building. One, I think we need to invest in aligning strategic policy and legislative frameworks from national to local level, all the way to community level. We've seen certainly a disconnect between sort of national level strategies and policies and how they relate at the community level and small cities. And I think Steve, in his comments, alluded to the financing related issues associated with local level action. I think that's linked to this disconnect. I think it's a very important and crucial element of resilience building. Of course, this convergence between national and local level policy. We also need to, secondly, strengthen governance systems and capacities to catalyze action around resilience building outcomes. This is an area UNDP strongly believes in. We're of the firm conviction that governance, including risk governance, is a linchpin and catalyst for transformative action for resilience building. When we say governance, UNDP is not only talking about the traditional governance approaches, but our approach seeks to foster systems approach that recognizes that not only the individual importance, but also the interdependencies between policies, laws, regulations, and frameworks, but also how each of these work together seamlessly to pave the way for improved and efficient decision-making, especially at the local and community level. The other area we would propose for investment is in preventing risk creation and investing in resilience through risk-informed development. One of the notions is that the concept of risk sits outside of the development process, but risk is a byproduct of development. So we have to also, invest, educate, and focus on how we're building up this risk in our development aspirations within the city space, within local communities, and to ensure that our approaches are informed with this knowledge that we can better manage them. And Jennifer would have outlined a range of approaches to manage that within her outputs on Global Shield. There are many others that can be applied. And of course, another area is in the digital space. So how can we bring an increased application of digital technologies and innovation to secure resilient futures? That's another area I think we need to begin to invest in building these capabilities. The need to increase and expand access to internet, mobile, digital technology related platforms that can open up newer opportunities for harnessing the potential of individuals, but also communities, their potential for raising their risk awareness, for building their resilience, whether it is from an economic lens or a social lens. And UNDP has been utilizing this particular avenue offered by digital technologies to reach out to some of the unreached and underserved communities. I spoke about our Urban Resilience Initiative. Part of it is going to focus on this particular area of digital. And then finally, approaches such as portfolio-based approaches and programmings. We need to now bring and knit the fabric of all of these, what appear to be siloed types of investments together. We need to bring these together more comprehensively within the context of an area-based approach. Again, our integrated urban risk and resilience for SIDS approach is really about that. It is bringing this integrated lens built around elements such as water, energy, health, and food. This is also a very important area. We believe food, water, and energy is the real nexus, for development going forward in the future. So we can intervene there and unlock macro benefits across our communities, whether they are rural-based or they're urban in nature. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ronald. I think it was important also that you raised the issue of this nexus of food, water, energy, and ways in which vulnerable sectors of communities particularly can play in the space. As the UNDP, are you targeting particular groupings? You mentioned, strengthened governance systems. So when you approach a particular region, or are you looking for certain aspects within this multi-level governance framework? Are you looking for particular vulnerable groupings to engage?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. UNDP works across a spectrum of groupings, but we are very much concerned about underserved populations. Targeting drivers. Looking at inequalities. High areas of vulnerability is certainly part of the UNDP forte. We're also quite concerned about countries that are facing complex challenges and deep crises. Again, how our innovative development solutions can be risk informed such that we are reducing this growing and burgeoning humanitarian need that is happening in many of these crisis countries. So yes, very much targeting the vulnerable, very much targeting issues around that drive inequalities. We have a program that is also focusing on issues around racism, all those variables that lead to high vulnerability. So that's UNDP's approach, essentially, to answer your question.
Yeah, transformative indeed. Yeah. So Jennifer, and this is a useful segue also for you to start, or for me to ask you from the Global Shield perspective, what kinds of financial instruments are available to communities, particularly in small island developing states?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's certainly one that's difficult to work on, knowing some of the challenges that exist when developing financial instruments in small island states. So when we think about the type of financial instruments that can be used to manage the impacts of climate events, the most obvious ones that we think about are types of credit that can be offered to different groups and communities. There's also insurance, which is growing in popularity, particularly in small island states, index and parametric insurance, which I'll explain a bit more about, and different savings schemes, as well as credit guarantees, which can help increase the number of people who are eligible to then receive these different types of support. Many of the other instruments that we talk about when thinking about managing climate disasters are more meant for macro level, but more and more we see a big emphasis on also working on this meso community level to see how we can develop instruments to meet their specific needs as well. And some of the challenges that exist then when trying to develop these different types of instruments is first, this lack of data that can exist, which makes it more difficult to estimate how much an insurance product like a parametric or index insurance should cost. And what we hope to see through this cooperation with the Global Risk Modeling Alliance and through continuous investments in early warning systems and data gathering is that our understanding of the risk and the likelihood of the events will also increase and will make these products then more affordable because we will have a better understanding of the likelihood of the different events affecting specific communities. What we also see is there's a lack of technical knowledge often when it comes to developing these different types of products, because a lot of the technologies are quite new and using satellite data or drone images in order to develop the risk model to determine the pricing for a financial instrument. A lot of this technical knowledge then needs to also be built up within the country in the community level so that they also have the same understanding of the risk. When developing these different types of products in small island states, it's also particularly difficult because of the small market size, which can lead to a lack of investment from the private sector, as well as the high level of heterogeneity within the group, meaning that unlike in some countries where you would have millions of people with the same risk profile and be able to develop one product for them, in small island states, because of the small population size and because of the landscape, which can include mountains, rivers, canals, coastal front properties, and forest, the risk that people are faced with differ very highly based on where in the island they're located, and thus it's difficult to identify exactly which type of product and which risk are needed for very small groups. And then lastly, what also needs to be thought about is the regulatory frameworks within countries. This also can make it very difficult to develop new types of financial instruments within the market. It can be very time consuming, as well as the distribution channels that would be needed in order to deliver this financial support directly to the community level. But we do see a lot of progress being made here with the development, as Ronald was saying, with digital technologies and thinking about how we can build up channels like mobile money within communities. We then see an increased possibility of providing this support in a much more streamlined and efficient manner than before. And so through the Global Shield, we aim to also help countries and communities overcome some of these challenges by providing this support on the risk analytics. With the Global Shield, it's a country-led support, and we aim to crowd in the voices then of all the different groups, vulnerable groups within the country, to identify what they see as the specific needs for themselves, and to also offer the support with strengthening the regulatory framework, which would allow for more products to be developed and to be introduced into the market, as well as seeing how we can better integrate these financial instruments into the overall disaster risk management planning. We also want to see how we can better link to early warning systems in order to effectively use these instruments when they're most needed, ideally even being triggered before an actual disaster, as well as investing in the development and strengthening of distribution channels, and seeing how different systems like social protection systems could be augmented in order to allow for these financial instruments, for example, an insurance product to come in that when there is a tropical cyclone, for example, that affects Fiji, we know that social welfare beneficiaries will need extra support. By attaching a type of insurance product to the system, then this support can immediately be triggered to those individuals and communities. And so with that, the focus that we're looking to identify through the work with the Global Shield is what are the different types of instruments, the money in instruments that can be used in order to provide the support to government, subnational governments, cities, and humanitarian agencies and CSOs that work directly with communities, as well as looking at the money out systems that can be used to deliver these financial products directly to the most affected groups. So, and with that, I'll summarize there for now.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Jennifer. And you know what? It's great to see that there are unique considerations that are emerging in the context of how you are rolling out your financial instruments in SIDS. That's good to know. I'm mindful of time, so yeah, Jennifer and Ronald, I would like to ask you, all right, what you would consider to be some of the barriers in which we are pursuing multi-level governance, and that is working with multi-sectors, with specific reference to the inclusion of local communities in climate resilience. What would you say are some of the risks? And we'll delve into the opportunities after that. But what would you say are some of the barriers in which your engagements are rolling out?
Shall I go first, or give Jennifer a chance to catch her breath since I think one of the big barriers that I see hindering community resilience building, particularly in SIDS, is certainly the high national debt profiles that existed in SIDS, which is very present in the Caribbean, and this can really divert resources away from the concerted investments which we talk about, particularly at the local levels, right? The prioritization is always in subnational level infrastructure, and national level systems sometimes when you're dealing with limited fiscal space. And the rubric of resilience often mentioned is never necessarily the initial space of investment in those contexts of high debt. So I think that's one of the areas we need to really focus on. Looking at, and you would have heard some of this earlier, the criteria for concessional financing, which is currently a hurdle facing SIDS. They have attained middle income or high income status and so do not qualify for this type of concessional financing, but their growth and their status sits on a knife's edge. One shock can push them, back into the throes of the challenges we see economically. There are some positive signals, even amidst that, where we see a growing, I would say, action towards tackling this particular challenge. And you see things like the Caribbean Resilience Fund being mooted as a means of addressing this. I think another challenge worth mentioning is a struggle to institutionalize resilience as a key development outcome in national and sectoral development plans, and embed resilience practices firmly across all of government, but society, as a shared development objective or outcome, if we want to say that. This often arises because resilience is primarily perceived as being solely related to risk management, and the strengthening of local government systems and capacities and enhancing collaborative actions across sectors and stakeholders are therefore going to be very, very critical, a step if we want to overcome this hurdle. And then a third, I think, associated with that is our understanding of the term resilience. You know, we see varied appreciation of what this term means, depending on the lens you're coming to it from. And so we need to invest in advancing, you know, one, the understanding of this, but also a people-centered approach to how we see resilience. Maybe some people refer to that traditionally as a bottom-up approach. In the context of UNDP, we've led a UN coalition to develop the UN Common Guidance on building resilience and building resilient societies. And this is something we're going to, you know, sort of invest in addressing the shared understanding, but also the capacities, not just across the UN system, but such that it percolates through to the member states. I'll stop there, just to leave some space, noting time for.
Yeah, no, indeed. And this shared understanding can bring about great complexity, isn't it? And variability, depending on where you are in the world and geography in responding to this. So, yeah. Jennifer, what would you see as barriers to
Yes,
resilience?
Yeah, so some of the barriers and challenges that exist very often when thinking about communities is the fact that often when working on developing these financial instruments, they'll be very heavily targeted to the national level and to the government level. And this is often done as it's seen as the most effective and efficient route to have the biggest impact because of the limited financial support that's given and amount of time to work on developing these different types of initiatives. You then see the emphasis going towards the most obvious groups, which include the national governments, as well as when thinking about countries, maybe certain cooperative groups within that country. And the point is then these smaller communities or particularly vulnerable groups like we see with women, if they're not already a strong voice within the country, they'll often be neglected when thinking about their specific needs. And I don't think it's done purposefully. I think very often when both the private sector as well as different institutions want to work within the country, they are looking for the most effective routes. But by concentrating on the loudest voices or the biggest groups, you then end up sometimes not tackling the specific needs of these smaller groups who are even more vulnerable to the events. But it's harder to work with them due to location, due to not having a strong cooperative community that can easily be outreached and contacted due to limitations like we see with internet access and this regular communication. And so really striving to include those voices into these processes needs to be done by those working to implement different projects, because without that, then you're not really targeting the needs of the most specific, most vulnerable groups within the countries.
Yeah, no, there are no doubt systemic issues that come to play here, and it's the vulnerable groups that have continued to be excluded. And maybe, I think, Steve, this is a useful segue for you to come in to basically share that at this year's COP, that's COP28 in the UAE, will be the first ever local climate action summit, which is designed to elevate the voice of local communities and local governments in particular.
Have I got an hour to respond to that one, Sharon?
Just in rounding up, and what you would like to see, what your expectations of this platform for SIDS would be to elevate the voice of local communities and governments.
Okay. And I wanted to pick up on something that each of the previous speakers said. I'm intrigued, Ronald, you raised the idea of what do we mean by resilience, and it's underpinning so many of the agreements and funding arrangements and so on, yet I think there is ambiguity around that. we tend to use resilience sometimes. Sometimes we'll say sustainability, and that we need to be clear. And I've grappled with that and have various approaches to it. But I think that's critical because we understand that the COPs are heading more towards adaptation and resilience considerations now, rather than just curbing greenhouse gases. And so once we see instruments and tools and initiatives being set up for resilience, I'm hoping that it's very clearly defined. And I'm also intrigued by disaster risk reduction, and I've worked in that field a lot. But something that we've found in a country like Kiribati, it's not so much about disasters, shocks, it's much more about slow onset stresses. We've had that conversation a number of times. What was your most recent disaster? And they really have to think, not even sure what you mean. We don't get cyclones, we don't get earthquakes. Start talking about the stresses, water shortage, gradually increasing heat, etc., and you really have a conversation with them. So there's a bit of a differentiation, whereas in Fiji, I absolutely agree. Infrastructure in Fiji now is being designed for Category 7 cyclones, even though they've never experienced anything more than a Category 5, because that's where they see the trajectory going. So bringing all this to the COPs, I think, and it's the multi-level governance and it's the bottom-up. We know that a lot of the major funders cannot deal directly with subnational governments. They have to form their agreements with the national governments. That's the rules. So we have to find a way that the national governments really understand the power of working at the lower levels. And that's where the work we do in the countries, communities, to councils, to the office of the president is so critical, because eventually that community pressure will start to find its way into government policies and programs. From the COP, I think the critical one is the NDCs, because it's important that when the countries make their next nationally developed contribution commitments, they build in mechanisms for providing support directly to subnational and local governments. And Sharon and I are quite involved in some of that work. And in fact, we will be helping to put together a regional stocktake report for the Pacific Islands to go into the COP28, which will be mapping out exactly that. It's what are the needs, the achievements, the progress and the needs of the subnational sector, and therefore what needs to be included in the next round of NDCs, so that you get the mechanism all the way down, the loss and damage, the resilience, adaptation, all of those mechanisms can filter down to where the action is needed most.
Yeah. No, thank you, Steve. And I think, and the only reason I allowed you to go on, with what you've just raised is that it's exactly what somebody had raised in the question and answer chat, and that it's these linkages with national policies that is critical, and in achieving resilience. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we've, with a minute to spare, I think we've come to the end of a wonderful discussion on strengthening resilience efforts in SIDS. And you've heard today some of the inspiring efforts that form important threads in an intricate tapestry of responses to the challenges that are confronted by these islands. I think we can all agree also that what is needed is a united multi-level governance approach, and one that sets a new paradigm for fully integrated climate action between all levels. And part of this rationale builds on the fact that it indeed takes many hands to make light work. We've seen the critical interventions advanced by donor agencies and our development partners, but of course, coordinating these efforts would be key, isn't it? Who better placed to coordinate this than local governments and their communities in co-designing these climate responses? And not only does this ensure that actions are co-designed and locally contextualized. Communities end up being empowered and being at the front and center of these solutions, and that's critical. Before we part ways, it would be remiss not to promote the next segment in the Daring Cities series of webinars. And this session topic builds on from resilience, the resilience theme that we discussed today, and it's on food. And this, of course, is in commemoration of a decade of ICLEI's City Food Program, which will be held in a similar format and will be held on the 26th of September, 1600 hours, Universal Time. So thank you, everybody, for joining this session. It has no doubt been a productive afternoon. I thoroughly relished the session and being amidst very insightful speakers. Keep up the good work. Take care and see you soon.